Hello, welcome to this latest session of the Gender, Socialism, and Post-Socialism workshop of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. Today, we're very honored to have a talk by Tina Bakuchava entitled Notes from the Georgian Opposition. Tina is aged 40. Is a Georgian politician who has served as a member of parliament since 2012. Very impressive. She's a member of the United Nationalists National Movement, and she joined the public service in Georgia after studying in the United States and after a short stint as a diplomat, where she became deputy head of the Chamber of Control. Following the victory of Georgian Dream in the 2012 parliamentary elections in Georgia, she became one of the most vocal opponents of the government and won re-election in 2016 and 2020. Since May 8th, 2023, she has been serving as chair of the United National Movement Party in the Georgian parliament. Bakuchava is also the chair of the United National Movement Women's Organization, which she founded in 2013. And as a leading figure of the United National Movement and the Women's Organization, she has been the subject of several gender-based attacks. She was born in Tbilisi. As a student, she moved to the United States and studied at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, from where she received a degree in political science in 2004. In 2008, she graduated with a master's degree in diplomacy and international law from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. It's my great honor to present Tina. And the format for this program today, for our session, will be that Tina will give an overview of her experiences and the current situation in Georgia, and then we'll begin to have a discussion. We welcome your questions, and we will use those as the basis of the discussion. So, Tina, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosal, and thank you so much to the Davis Center for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you today. Before delving into the role of gender in Georgian politics, I'd like to offer a very brief overview of Georgian political life since Georgia regained its independence from the Soviet Union. Since we regained independence in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Georgia was ruled by former Soviet Union foreign minister by the name of Eduard Shevardnadze, who for 12 years essentially presided over a failed state where we had dysfunctional institutions, where we had pervasive corruption and extreme poverty. The 2003 peaceful Rose Revolution that was led by Columbia and Georgetown educated Mikhail Saakashvili ushered in an era of swift reforms, propelling Georgia in international ratings and earning Georgia the place of #1 reformer from the World Bank, for example. In 2012, in the first ever democratic electoral transition of power in our region, not just in Georgia, a new government was elected, led by billionaire Bedzina Ivanishvili, who earned his fortune in the 90s Russia, but was able to liquidate most of his assets in Russia right before going into politics in Georgia, precipitating concerns of possible Russian electoral subversion. Although the previous government had accumulated its discontents, its pro-Westernness had never been questioned, while the foreign policy course of the current government is being increasingly questioned in European capitals and other friends in the West. I entered politics, as Rochelle noted, right at this juncture in 2012 in Georgia, elected through the former government party on the proportionate party list, the United National Movement, or UNM. I was at the time 29 years old. I'd gotten a BA in government from Smith College, was a minor in international affairs. I had earned my master's degree at the Fletcher School, as well as having spent a semester at the Geneva Institute for International Studies. I had defended my country's interests as the chargé d'affaires in Geneva, in the United Nations and other international organizations, had negotiated with the Russians, including on the accession of Russia to the WTO. I had served as the deputy head of the International Organizations Department in the Foreign Ministry and the deputy auditor at the State Audit Office, and worked at the National Democratic Institute, both in Washington and in Tbilisi, on programs strengthening parliament and empowering women. But when I was elected in 2012, all anyone was interested to inquire about were not my academic or professional credentials, but how old I was and which male politician did I serve as an extension of. Welcome to politics, I thought to myself, facing a 60-year-old male politician from the ruling party at my very first parliamentary sitting, making sexist and derogatory statements about me publicly on the plenary parliamentary hall, referring to me, quote unquote, as a child that was being sexually exploited, I quote. Well, here we are today, 11 years after those comments, having been elected for the third consecutive term in the Parliament of Georgia, serving as the chair of the largest opposition faction in Parliament, having founded the UNM Women's Organization, which is to date the largest political women's organization, a member of my party's political council and the secretariat, and having a seat at the table for all major party decision-making. Coincidentally, that particular male politician I mentioned has been dusted to political irrelevance. So yes, politics is male-dominated, and in addition to the glass ceiling women encounter in countries of long democratic tradition, such as the United States, as Secretary Hillary Clinton famously stated, whom I had the chance to meet during her visit in Georgia as Secretary of State. But we in countries in hybrid regimes or semi-authoritarian states, in addition to the glass ceiling, often face literally a barrage of stones and bricks as well. But perseverance, courage, and frequent reminders to yourself that you really are serving a higher purpose render a woman invincible, it seems, in the eyes of men that are used to subservience or deference or discretion, especially in societies where social norms relegate women to the role of mothers, homemakers, and caretakers. The war in Ukraine, after the unprovoked invasion by Putin, show that courage has no gender, and that archaic gender stereotyping makes our societies weaker, not stronger, and has no place in democracies. So as Rochelle noted, this will be a very brief introduction from me, and I am very interested in hearing questions also from Rochelle and others participating in this talk. So I will end there, and I'm eager to hear your questions. Thank you so much.
So Tina, I will start. So could you talk a little bit about what the current situation is in Georgia in terms of the effects of the Ukraine war? Part of Georgia, as I understand it, is still occupied by Russian troops, is a kind of occupied enclave within Georgia. And then in addition to that, because of the mobilization, you had a big influx of Russian, mostly men, I assume, into Georgia. So could you talk about just what's been happening since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine in February?
Absolutely. After the unprovoked invasion by Russia of Ukraine, which we see really as an extension of the war that was started in 2008 against Georgia, when Putin invaded Georgia, as a result of which 20% of Georgia remains occupied. The situation in Georgia has become even more difficult than what we were previously facing, because the moves of the government have become increasingly questioned as to whether or not their foreign policy had shifted away from the declared intention to join NATO and the EU and towards a more sympathetic policy towards the Russians. And that is something that is very problematic also in terms of Georgia's aspiration to join the EU and at this current juncture to receive so-called candidate status from the European Union, which is essentially a formal way of opening negotiations for accessions for Georgia into the European Union. Candidate status is something that both Ukraine and Moldova have received a few months ago, but in what is referred to as the association trio with Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, unfortunately, Georgia was denied candidate status. And the European Union has cited lack of desire for reform on the part of the government, as well as decreasing alignment of Georgian foreign policy with EU foreign policy on the war in Ukraine as reasons for why Georgia was denied candidate status. We have another very important juncture coming up at the beginning of November, where the European Commission will once again address Georgia's candidate status. And we have been going around European capitals to promote and advocate for Georgia to receive candidate status and join Ukraine and Moldova on the accessions path. But unfortunately, there is quite a bit of skepticism among the 27 member states in the EU, precisely because of lack of desire by the government to implement reform. Recently, Joseph Borrell, who is the High Representative of the European Union, was in Tbilisi. And this is exactly what he spoke about. There are 12 recommendations that have been issued by the European Union that Georgia has to fulfill, and judicial reform is one of them. De-oligarchization, as well as depolarization, also inclusion of civil society in decision-making process. This is the reform agenda that has been put forward to the Georgian government. But he said, unfortunately, 9 out of 12 recommendations are unfulfilled. And he cited the misalignment, again, of foreign policy of Georgia with the EU, particularly on the war in Ukraine. And when it comes to the war in Ukraine and the influx of Russians that you mentioned, this is also coupled by mass exodus, I would say, of Georgian citizens leaving Georgia. Almost 100,000 Georgian citizens have left in the last year, and these are usually young, fiercely pro-Western Georgians that are leaving Georgia. So we're dealing with huge brain drain and an influx of Russians who are not necessarily dissidents of the regime, because we had a number of instances where actual dissidents of the Putin regime, including journalists of Dozhd, for example, an independent television that was shut down in Russia, and others that tried to enter Georgia but were denied entry. However, others are granted access. They're granted the ability to purchase real estate, also to open businesses. And this is, of course, feared by many Georgians as an instrument for Putin of hybrid warfare, because we have seen instances where Putin subsequently justifies territorial invasions and use of force to, quote unquote, protect his citizens. So this is a big worry that we have also voiced in Parliament and have suggested some changes to legislation, and namely to the law on occupied territories, to introduce certain constraints that would allow the government to limit in certain ways this uncontrolled influx of Russians in Georgia in circumstances of occupation. But unfortunately, we have not heard a lot of desire from the government to take these amendments, these legal amendments, into consideration. Other issues that are of concern to us in terms of the Ukraine context are certain anti-Ukrainian statements from the government, as well as, for example, the Prime Minister stating that the war in Ukraine can be attributed to NATO and Ukraine's desire to join NATO, which we believe is a very dangerous narrative to spread in Georgia, because it is very much in line with Russian propaganda and tries to erode the pro-Western, pro-NATO, and pro-EU sentiments in the Georgian public. We have also been very disappointed by the fact that the government has been unwilling to join the sanctions regime, which the Ukrainians believe is a very important way to constrain Russians. There are also some concerns being raised on the possibility of Georgian territory being used as a transit country to evade Russian sanctions. This is, of course, also of great concern to our Western partners and to the United States. And the sanctions architecture in general that the Georgian government has time and again declared as ineffective. Part of the reason may be that the current government is very wary of the sanctions regime being used against them as well. And one of the reasons we say this is because recently, for example, the former prosecutor, the general prosecutor of Georgia, who continues to de facto control the prosecution's office and is a key person for Ivanishvili's government, was sanctioned by the United States for his connection to the Russian security services and his attempt to spread malign Russian influence in Georgian public and political life. He was specifically, the sanctions designation specifically described him as a Russian Georgian oligarch, which is a description that is very often used for Ivanishvili. And I think that in itself also was not by chance, and it may be quite clear that the message that the West would like Ivanishvili to receive is that sanctions might actually be expanded unless the democratic backsliding that we have seen in Georgia and its increasing misalignment with pro-Western foreign policy is actually stopped, and the Georgian government takes up the reforms that are necessary for Georgia to be successful on its Euro-Atlantic integration path.
Thanks. We have a couple of questions, and before I ask you those questions, I just wanted to clarify, why are Georgians leaving Georgia? Is that because of the pro-Russian government? Is it because of the economic situation in Georgia? Why the 100,000 leaving?
I believe that it's primarily because of lack of hope of a European future. I think, Georgia has not been a particularly affluent country, but the trajectory for most people, and particularly for young people, was always that Georgia was moving closer to the Western world and closer to EU accession, which is of paramount importance to absolute majority of Georgians, because public opinion polling shows that the support for Georgia's EU membership is up to 90%. And I think the latest moves by the government showed, particularly to the young people, that unfortunately this trajectory has certainly been halted, but perhaps derailed for the foreseeable future. And that is why many decide to seek, their livelihoods and take their families outside of Georgia. And this is particularly problematic when we're dealing with an influx of Russians who are taking the places of Georgians in many regards, including in terms of employment.
So the desire to become part of the EU is it coupled with a desire to be part of NATO, or is that really a separate issue?
So traditionally, if you look at it in terms of a time series analysis, always desire to join NATO has been slightly lower, albeit it has still nevertheless always been in the high 70s and is currently around 80%, whereas desire to join the EU is even higher. I think this slight discrepancy and what accounts for the difference between a slightly lower NATO support and the slightly higher EU support is precisely the fear that the Russian propaganda tries to instill in Georgians, in Ukrainians, and in anybody in its neighborhood that dares to aspire to NATO membership, that this is against their strategic and military interests. And this is why I believe the Georgian government should be much more careful in not mimicking Putin's messaging and propagating that narrative that Georgia's or Ukraine's desire to join NATO could instigate military action from Putin, because in a way that sort of reiterates and justifies the narrative that Putin tries to spread through his massive propaganda machinery within Russia and in its neighbors.
So let me now ask you some of the questions that are in the Q&A. Valerie Sperling asks, first of all, she says, great to see you again. Could you comment on the situation with Georgia's female president and the effort to impeach her? What happened? And do you think there's a gender component to the way she has been received as president?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Valerie, for this question. I was really hoping someone would prompt this question, and if nobody did, I wanted to mention it on my own account. In fact, part of the reason some of our planning, including for this trip, had to be shifted around was because the impeachment process came to Parliament just this week, when on Wednesday, the Parliament took a vote. And as I mentioned, I am chairing the largest opposition faction in Parliament. There are 20 members of Parliament in our faction. And unfortunately, there had been a very long propaganda campaign against UNM, against my party and my faction, that we were inclined to vote in favor of the impeachment of the president, despite the fact that it is not our party that instigated this process. It was the ruling party, which coincidentally ran her campaign. And if we're speaking about the gender component, yes, there has certainly been a gender component from day one of the president's election campaign. And it became most apparent, most palpable when the president lost the current president as candidate then, as the government candidate that is now trying to impeach her, lost the first round to an opposition candidate that I was supporting. And as a result of that, Ivanishvili, who must have thought that it was the fact that she was a woman that perhaps was projecting a weak image, instead of her pictures, put up pictures of men on her electoral posters. So the posters you would see, the huge billboards you would see throughout Georgia that encouraged Georgian voters to vote for Salome Zurabishvili, a female candidate, had men and their portraits pasted all over. Those same men who argued before the Constitutional Court and subsequently in Parliament that she had to be impeached. And the very reason the Georgian Dream, the ruling party, instigated the impeachment process, which first went to the Constitutional Court, which of course made a political decision, was because of her travel to European capitals to do just what we have been doing, which is to advocate for Georgia's EU candidate status. The government has claimed that this is unconstitutional, which is absurd because the Article 78 of the Georgian Constitution says that, which is an amendment actually that the Georgian Dream itself put into the Constitution a few years ago. It says that every constitutional body must take upon itself to do whatever it can to bring Georgia into Euro-Atlantic institutions. And it is precisely what the president was doing. So to impeach her for that is completely absurd. And in terms of the gender aspect of the whole process, I believe that the personal attacks that President Zurabishvili has been a target of, and if we are to dissect the language that has been used against her, it would become apparent how strong the gender aspect has been in this negative campaign against her. For example, the chair of the ruling party, Irakli Kobakhidze, who is also the former chair of the parliament and continues to be really the de facto chair of parliament today, as he controls the majority, in his open speech in parliament, called the president this, quote unquote, this 70-year-old woman who has no shame, etc. So yes, the gender element is there, as it has been against pretty much all opponents of the government. And I must say here, and I will end here on this particular question, that the reason the current president departed with the ruling majority is precisely because the ruling majority's lack of desire to stay on course in terms of its foreign policy. And this is something that she has stated unequivocally. She has stated very openly, and we have many disagreements with her to this date, including, for example, the issue of former President Saakashvili, who is incarcerated, and we believe on political grounds, she has a different view. She hasn't used her constitutional authority to pardon him. And we have many other political differences. But the fact is that she's being impeached on absurd grounds, which are purely political, that have no constitutional basis. And the real reason for that is because she has departed from the government narrative, and Ivanishvili has therefore questioned her loyalty, and she has been outspoken about the fact that the government has not been true to its promises on bringing Georgia closer to the European Union.
So along those lines, I'm flipping the next two questions. Could you talk a little bit more about your own experiences with sexism and misogyny as a parliamentarian, which have included, as I understand it, some physical violence towards you?
Yes. Like I mentioned previously, I think women in all countries, even in countries with long democratic traditions, such as the United States, are more vulnerable to personal attacks than men are. But this is even more exacerbated in semi-authoritarian states, or in hybrid regimes, or in democracies that are not consolidated in terms of institutional strength, where you can have recourse, for example, to independent investigation, or you can have recourse to an independent judiciary. I mean, even now, unfortunately, just looking at the news of the last 2 days, unfortunately, death threats and these type of threats, it seems, have become part of political life, even in this country. But that is something that we have dealt with in Georgia as members of the opposition, and particularly as women, for a very long time. In Parliament, almost on a daily basis, you see that you become a target of gender-based attacks. And this is true pretty much for all members of the opposition who are women, who are deliberately targeted, particularly by the speaker, who was just a regular member of parliament when he attacked me physically because we were protesting against a pogrom against LGBTQ people, and then subsequently on journalists, that had been organized by government proxies. And those people to date, the perpetrators and the organizers who were publicly announcing the use of violence have to date not been brought to justice. And this is something that brought many people to the streets and caused a lot of protest in the Georgian public. And so we were just voicing these concerns in the Georgian parliament, and that became the reason for a physical attack by who now has been promoted subsequent to this physical act of violence to the post of Speaker of Parliament. And now he uses his discretionary powers as Speaker of Parliament to continue to attack women with gender-based comments pretty much after every single political speech that we make, which is usually critical, but critical politically and never personally. But these boundaries don't seem to exist for the men when they're attacking women. If we also look at some research done on social media, including by the National Democratic Institute, which is an organization that I used to work on, it shows that women are at least twice as much prone to personal attacks on social media than men. And usually these are very, vicious and often profane use of language that we see on social media. And another aspect I think that I should mention is the protests that we participate in, and how a lot of times the police target women at these protests. That is what I mean when I say that in addition to the structural obstacles that women face in many countries in politics, where mostly politics is male dominated. In Georgia, a lot of times we face physical violence and a barrage of stones and bricks. For example, recently we were in a local town speaking with pensioners because there's a very important election coming up in 2024, and we have already started our electoral campaign. And this is one of our campaign proposals is to increase pensions. So we were meeting with some pensioners, and government organized violent groups started throwing stones at us. And obviously in that situation, it is not specifically targeted at women, but the damage that you incur as a woman, being targeted by physical violence in a society that propagates, the role of women as mothers and caretakers, and sort of giving preference to more docile settings for women. Obviously, for a woman being involved in that kind of a violent setting is something that affects your image going forward as a politician in a very negative light. Whereas men in these kinds of sort of macho societies, well, for them, violence may be a part of life. But for women, it's a very negative light in which it shows you.
I just want to ask you a little bit about LGBT rights. It seems that one of the Putinist policies have been very focused on anti-LGBT and talking about the quote unquote traditional family and anti-trans legislation. So has that been as much a focus in Georgia? Because there's also the rumors or whatever, when I was in the Soviet Union, that Georgian men were very prone to homosexuality.
Well, to your first question, yes, it is very much part of government policy and propaganda that, quote unquote, the decadent West will increase homosexuality in Georgia. There we had a vice speaker of parliament who made a statement, a public statement, stating that we didn't want the European Union and accession into the European Union if it was going to force us all to become lesbian, I quote. So this is, of course, very much a Putinist propaganda line that in order to preserve, quote unquote, family traditional values, we must stay away from the West, wrap ourselves up in our own cocoon, and at very best have the protection of the quote unquote big brother from the North, i.e. Putin. And that is the only way we can quote unquote protect our children from not having quote unquote traditional orientations. And this is, this is a government line. The Minister of Defense recently pronounced that liberalism, for example, is a national security threat to Georgia. And of course, what he meant by that is precisely to try to get to the Georgian psyche on these traditional values, because the overwhelming majority of Georgians are Christian Orthodox. It is clear to the world, and I'm sure to this audience, what the stance of the Christian Orthodox Church is on this issue. And of course, the government tries to manipulate those sentiments and in that way also try to chip away at the high level of support for EU integration. But the good news is, and the increasing friendship, for example, of Prime Minister Georgia with Viktor Orban, who was recently in Tbilisi, who spent, a very cozy time with the Prime Minister and his wife for a couple of days, and et cetera, this all, and the Prime Minister's participation in a number of far-right events that are supposed to propagate precisely these quote unquote family values, traditional values. All of this makes it apparent that this is, a Putinist propaganda line that the government tries to use for its electoral purposes, and tries to demonize the West and the European Union, the United States, as well as the opposition, by the way, as forces that are trying to attack these quote unquote traditional family values. Coincidentally, the son of the very prime minister who propagates this Putinist line recently was accepted to University of Pennsylvania, which to the best of my knowledge is a quite liberal school. And one of the MPs, in fact, during government question hour that we call the interpellation process, asked him what his thoughts on that were. That, for example, in UPenn, there's an LGBTQ center that defends the rights of all minorities. And when on the one hand, he was trying to convince the Georgian public that the quote unquote decadent West and liberalism are a threat to Georgian traditional values, why is it that he picks not Russian universities for his son to study in, much like a lot of Putin's cronies? why does he also, like Putin's cronies, choose Western universities and universities in the United States? But of course, they know full well that it's a faux discourse that has no basis whatsoever with reason or rationale. But it is something that Putin has proven can be used to, quote unquote, influence the masses. And unfortunately, it's another hybrid warfare instrument that the Georgian government chooses to use against its own population.
No, it's interesting because just as you were saying that, there's a election for Speaker of the House of Representatives here. And one of the scandals at the moment is that a supporter of Jim Jordan called and made horrible threats, obscene threats against not the representative who voted against Jordan, but his wife. So kind of standard, again, the gender politics. You don't go after the man, you go after the woman to get at the man,
Right.
in this case. But yeah, no, and of course, I was going to ask you, is there any sex abuse scandal in the Georgian Orthodox Church the way there is in the Catholic Church?
No, there have been other scandals, but not of that sort. For example, the possible case of a poisoning of the head of the Orthodox Church, the patriarch, who is very popular and therefore very, very influential. But many believe that this is also a political case, and the charges were fabricated against him. But he continues to be incarcerated on these charges of potentially having wanted to use arsenic, which is very sort of medieval, against the current patriarch in order to overthrow him.
Okay.
But the church is very influential in Georgia. And of course, the government, for example, we've paid attention to the fact that for every time the prime minister makes a trip either to the United States or to one of the Western capitals, if not every single time, then in between he pays his visit and his tribute to the Patriarch of Georgia, to remind to the Georgians that he has not swayed, quote unquote, from the true traditional Orthodox values that he and his government represent.
So do you know, is the Georgian Orthodox Church very allied with the Russian Orthodox Church, which under Patriarch Kirill has been one of the cheerleaders for the war in Ukraine? Are they politically more neutral, or?
Not as openly as Kirill's Russian Orthodox Church, but we certainly would have liked for the Georgian Orthodox Church to be more vocal on the war and what it represents, and their lack of desire also to recognize what is referred to as the autocephalic nature, or the autonomy essentially of the Ukrainian church, which parted with the Russian Orthodox Church. And this became certainly a very important political issue also, and one of national identity after the war. The Georgian Orthodox Church, unfortunately, has not been willing to recognize the autonomy of the Ukrainian church, which is a statement in itself.
Yeah. I want to kind of move to another topic that we have another question about, which is, about the Saakashvili years. First of all, what is the condition at this point of Mikhail Saakashvili, who was leader of Georgia and is now in jail? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. Well, unfortunately, his health condition is quite dire. He has many different medical conditions which have been confirmed by independent experts, medical experts that have been granted access to him, including through the Public Defender's Office, as well as foreign medical experts that were designated by the Polish government. He was subjected to inhuman and degrading treatment, which caused a huge outcry also from a lot of our international friends. Of course, the current government would argue that no one stands above the law in order to justify President Saakashvili's continued incarceration. But when you have organizations such as Amnesty International calling it a political witch hunt and pointing to political persecution against the president, A, and B, when you have essentially all of the Western world and certainly the EU stating that the current Georgian judiciary is not independent and that there is clan-based decision-making that renders political decisions rather than upholding the rule of law. Of course, it becomes abundantly clear that really the Ivanishvili government is persecuting Mikhail Saakashvili on political grounds. And in fact, Bidzina Ivanishvili has been quite forthcoming to the Georgian public in eliciting the political nature of President Saakashvili's incarceration when he said that if Misha, which is how he is referred to by many, only left politics, then all investigations and all criminal proceedings against him would be terminated. These are words that belong to him, which make it clear again that this is political revenge. At this point, what we have advocated for and have worked with our foreign partners, although unfortunately have not seen a lot of desire from the Georgian government to acquiesce to, is a transfer of President Saakashvili out of Georgia on medical grounds. And that is something that a number of European countries have also openly called for. The Polish government has even offered Poland as the place where he could be treated, he could receive adequate medical treatment, and that would really allow Georgia to move forward. That would allow for depolarization, which is one of the main requirements for EU accession, and it would allow Georgia to politically to move forward and to actually start fulfilling some of those reform priorities that the European Union is expecting of us. But unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of desire from the part of the government to open a reasonable discussion on this matter because of the personal animosity that Bidzina Ivanishvili has against Mikhail Saakashvili.
Let me just ask you the other part of what was being asked about Saakashvili, which is his policies. Elizabeth Wood asks that in the Saakashvili years, Georgia was able to make positive steps in police reform. And what do you think it would take to move judicial reform and de-oligarchization forward for EU access at this point?
Thank you for that question. I mentioned in passing that Georgia had earned the designation from the World Bank as the #1 reformer, precisely for the swift and very bold reforms that were implemented after the Peaceful Rose Revolution in 2003. And one of the reform areas was certainly the police, where almost 90% of all police officers from the Shevardnadze era that were corrupt had been fired overnight. And I was at the time a student at Smith College, but when government officials of the time recalled the story, they said everyone had been petrified that if the country was left without any police officers, that crime would be uncontrollable. And they laughed in saying that, in fact, crime went down because the police was so inextricably linked to the criminal world at the time. So this was a very bold reform process where the entire police force was replaced and a modern, professionally trained police force was put in place, free of corruption. But to be entirely objective, certain reform areas that I believe should have gone further, but were not under our government was, for example, the independence of judiciary. While corruption was definitely eradicated, more work had to be done to ensure the judicial independence of judges from the prosecutors. And that is something that the Georgian Dream promised to the Georgian public. And I'm sure that the Georgian public expected they would deliver on. But unfortunately, we have seen that there has only been increasing concentration of power in the hands of these very influential, corrupt judges, which, by the way, have also been sanctioned by the United States precisely because of corruption. In terms of, the second part of the question on what can be done and how Georgia could move forward on de-oligarchization and judicial reform, it's all a matter of political will. There's nothing that's not doable. There's nothing that we don't have the skills and the experience and knowledge to accomplish. There are plenty of very competent civil society organizations that have been long working, and experts, independent experts that have been long working on judicial reform. And everyone knows what has to be done. But unfortunately, there is lack of desire from the government and from the oligarch himself to let go of this power that they have concentrated in the judiciary. Why? Because this is their way of their guarantee that they stay in power, because they can use the courts against political opponents, such as the case for Mikhail Saakashvili. They can use as well as many others, by the way. It would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that almost every other opposition leader has been either in and out of jail at a certain point of their political life, or has been charged. And this doesn't relate just to my own party, but also, for example, to Lelo, which is a somewhat new opposition political party, but precisely because they went up against the ruling party and their policies. They have also been targeted by political persecution and escaped prison just by I think because of the Western support also, and because of the political price, perhaps, that Ivanishvili realized he would have to pay. But he's also targeted media owners. We have 3 critical media channels in Georgia that broadcast nationally. And out of these 3 media channels, one director, and a leading journalist has been in prison and was pardoned by the president that was now being impeached by the ruling party. And 2 the owners have been under investigation and have been threatened with prison sentences. He uses the court for things like the impeachment process. So he targets the president using the constitutional court. So it's an instrument for Ivanishvili to stay in power. It's also very important in the electoral prism, because no matter how widespread electoral fraud may be, if you take up your electoral complaints through the judicial system, you always know what the final answer of the courts is going to be. And it's going to be to render political decisions to ensure that the incumbent government stays in power. So it's a very important building stone for the regime, and therefore Ivanishvili does not have the political will to move forward on the reforms. Now, not to be so grim in my outlook, what I do think will be an opportunity for Georgia to move forward and to actually fulfill those recommendations that have been put forward by the European Union is, I believe, a coalition government. Because recent history has shown that single party governments have its challenges, and certainly institutional independence and checks and balances cannot be guaranteed. And this government has proven that time and again, despite its promises to allow Georgia to evolve on its democratic trajectory. So what we're hoping for and working on and looking towards is a coalition government of pro-Western political parties that inherently has the institutional balances that are needed in order to move forward the reform agenda that would allow institutions to actually gain independent decision-making power, which is so essential for an independent judiciary. And that would mean also taking the levers of control away from one party, not only one party rule, but one man rule that we currently have in the form of Ivanishvili, that has his former assistant as the prime minister, and essentially all ministers, or the majority of the ministers, I should say, are former employees at his bank. Or the Minister of Interior or the Minister or the State Security Service chief are his former bodyguards. And I could go on and on. The former health minister was his personal doctor. So, we have a case of complete state capture where it's not just one party decision-making, but one man decision-making who pulls the strings in every branch of Georgian government. And this is, of course, no way to govern, and no way certainly to govern in a democratic way and in a European way, which is precisely why our European friends have spelled out that in the Georgian context, de-oligarchization means de-bidzinization, they said. In the European Parliament. And for that, we need to move from a single party government to a coalition government of Western coalition parties.
Thank you. That was very helpful in terms of kind of sketching out the current situation, the political situation. I want to go back to, we have another question from Valerie Sperling to particularly women's and gender issues. She asks, have you made any connections or alliances between your party's women's organization and the ruling party's women's organization, if Georgian Dream even has a women's organization? And are there issues on which women parliamentarians could find common ground despite their party affiliation?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a very important question, and one that is very close to heart for me, because even from the days of my work at the National Democratic Institute, I had, which is, before I even entered politics or the diplomatic service, I had advocated for a women's caucus within the Georgian parliament that would allow precisely for that, for cross-party collaboration on issues that are important to women. But unfortunately, Georgian political life currently is so extremely polarized that not to speak even of policies that we could support and table together, but of just mere statements public statements of support. When I was attacked, for example, on the plenary hall by a male member of parliament physically, or when other abhorrent facts take place that are clearly gender-based and clearly are discriminatory against women, we can never get a member from the ruling party to criticize those actions, let alone join hands with us to implement policy that would help us prevent these types of actions in the future. So unfortunately, this polarization, again, is not something that is amenable to the kind of cross-party collaboration that really would be in the interest of every Georgian woman. In terms of the women's organization, in fact, as I mentioned, our women's organization, that of the United National Movement, was formed in 2013. And here, my male colleagues might not be pleased, but for transparency, which I always admire in politics, there was a lot of skepticism within my own party when I kept pushing for a women's organization, and that it was an important platform around which women of my party could coalesce and could build support networks and could advocate for each other and for the right of women to not only be doing the party grunt work, so to speak, particularly around elections, on door-to-door campaigns, or as members of the electoral commissions, which are overwhelmingly, if not 100% women, but rather to have a seat at the table and be the decision makers, but also be included in the party lists. And it was taken, it was taken with a lot of skepticism, but finally they kind of had to succumb to the continuous pressure that we exercised. But very soon our male colleagues saw how powerful the women's organization became and what an important party instrument it also was for the party overall. And including on trips to the United States, for example, I would hear very high-ranking Georgian Dream, so the ruling party female members, point to our women's organization and saying how effective it was and how powerful it was, and how they had long wanted to establish a women's organization, but I guess there must not have been, a lot of appetite on that. But recently, just a couple months ago, they actually formed a women's organization. But it remains to be seen, what their work is like. But certainly we have not received any overtures of collaboration to date, and I don't expect there to be any in the near future. One thing that I should say on women's representation is that we do have gender quotas in Georgia, which is sort of a big subject of discussion in many parliamentary democracies, with low levels of representation of women in politics. The first parliament that I was a part of had about 11%, then due to some changes, it moved up to 13. But currently, because of the mandatory gender quota, we have 30% representation, which obliges every party that registers with the Central Election Commission for parliamentary elections to have at least 30% women on their lists. And the additional legislative criterion that was very important and became added as part of our advocacy, and very importantly also the advocacy of the task force from the women's movement, was that it was not just 30%, because then what was being done is that the women were relegated to the ends of the lists rather than to the winnable seats. but rather every third candidate had to be a woman. And that if that candidate had, for whatever reasons, be replaced once elected, she had to be replaced by a woman. Because, for example, in our neighboring Armenia, there were mandatory quotas, but we had cases where men would enlist either spouses or women or sisters or other members of the family on the lists, and subsequently they would withdraw from the lists after having been elected, and of course the seats would be filled by men. This has been fortunately left to the past, but also in Georgia now we have legislative norms that provide safeguards against such manipulations, and we have a parliament as well as local municipal councils that have at least 30% women.
Zaur, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right here. Zaur Kapanadze asks, do oppositional parties besides UNM know that they have to overcome a 5% threshold in the 2024 elections to get represented in parliament? While most of the parties are weak and lack institutions that allow them to penetrate into society, are they working on developing a strong party brand and investing in ideational capital for future legislative elections?
Thank you, Zaur, for this question. It's an important one ahead of the 2024 parliamentary elections. It must be noted here that as part of the so-called April 19th agreement, which was negotiated, also referred to as the Charles Michel Agreement, that was negotiated after the 2020 parliamentary elections. One of the requirements had been for the government to adopt a 2% electoral threshold. That required constitutional amendments that the government introduced and voted on, supported it, but subsequently reneged on this agreement and declared it canceled, essentially, not being willing to move forward for the second and the third hearing, which is necessary for any law to be passed. So currently, as Zaur rightly pointed out, we have a 5% threshold. Current opinion polls indicate that only 3 parties would cross that 5% electoral threshold. It is my own party, the United National Movement. It is former Prime Minister Giorgi Gaharia's party, who left the Georgian Dream government and went into the opposition, citing, much like the president, also its concerns regarding the current government's foreign policy shift, among others, and the ruling party Georgian Dream. This is, of course, a point of concern because there are many other, as I rightly mentioned, smaller opposition parties that would not be able to cross a 5% threshold, and therefore the votes that are cast for those parties would essentially be lost, because whoever gets number 1 in the proportional party list takes the predominantly takes the so-called lost votes. So what we have proposed is coalition building. I mean, we think that the answer here lies in coalition building to make sure that no opposition votes are lost. And we ourselves, the United National Movement, has formed a pre-electoral coalition with another pro-Western party called Strategy Builder, with its leader, Georgi Vashadze. We have had very good collaboration in the past when, for example, in the 2018 presidential elections, our joint candidate in the first round won basically and got number one, the first place. But unfortunately, so far, other parties on the opposition spectrum have not been able to coalesce. But I hope that in the months ahead of the 2024 elections, we will see more coalition building that would ensure that they develop the party structures that Zaur is referring to, and most importantly, that they're able to garner 5% of popular vote in order to be able to cross the threshold and therefore ensure that these opposition votes are not lost and attributed essentially to the ruling party in the final distribution, in the final allocation of parliamentary seats, because obviously we're a parliamentary republic. And it is Parliament that subsequently forms government and votes on a prime minister.
So piggybacking on that question, one from Sarah Swartz, does the success of the recent coalition in Poland provide a model for Georgia, do you think?
Yes, definitely. Although the coalition building is happening also post-electorally. But I think what we have to keep in mind is that despite the fact that there has been, I know, some criticism, within Poland, reflected also in the poll, as well as in the European Union, of government policies in Poland, we have to keep in mind that we were dealing with a democracy, despite the criticisms. In Georgia, unfortunately, we're dealing, and I'm quoting here, not just as myself, as an opposition leader who obviously has its own views on the government, but also people like Jean Shaheen, who is a ranking senator and a longtime friend of Georgia, and was also very engaged on Ukraine and on our region in general, who has openly in Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearings, for example, voiced concerns about the increasing authoritarianism of the current government, of the current Georgian government. And what is the fundamental criterion, if we can speak of one, the common denominator of all semi-authoritarian states? It is their desire to stay in power at any cost. And that is through manipulation of elections. And that is a big challenge that we as the opposition face. And, when I speak to the election monitoring organizations, many of which will now come to Georgia precisely because everyone understands the importance of these upcoming elections, be it the long-term observers that are deployed a couple of months before the elections, or monitors who already have started to come to Georgia to parse through the various instruments of possible fraud that the government can use. They are such inherent structural elements of fraud that the government instrumentalizes against its own people months before the elections, such as, for example, massive intimidation campaigns against socially vulnerable individuals, the number of which, by the way, is historically high right now. These are individuals that receive subsistence payments from the government, and they're told that if they don't vote for government, they will lose these benefits. And living in a post-Soviet country, where illegal surveillance is systemic, and a recent leak from the State Security Service provided yet another piece of evidence that illegal surveillance is systemic, where the government was apparently illegally wiretapping phones of not just opposition members, because I know full well that my phone is illegally wiretapped, but also of diplomats, for example, ambassadors, which, goes not just against Georgian law, but international law and the Vienna Convention and so on and so forth. The belief among the Georgian public that the secrecy of their vote is secured, that when they cast their vote, it is their decision that the government has no access to, unfortunately, is not there. They are absolutely certain that the government knows their electoral preference when they make their choice at the ballot box. And the next election is going to be the first time when we will have electronic voting. And although it has some benefits, it also has some downsides. And I think the downsides are, number one, to what extent the data protection will not be vulnerable to Russian meddling, which, of course, cannot be excluded. And number two, to what extent it will not be accessible to the government, and what the perception among the Georgian public is going to be on whether or not these electronic databases are not accessible to the government. And many other elements of fraud that I could list that unfortunately don't guarantee that the will of the Georgian people will actually be reflected in the final election outcome, because the very desire of the government is to use these structural elements months and months and months before the elections to skew the final election result to their benefit and therefore to stay in power. So yes, some European examples, including the Polish example, are important for us to look at. But unfortunately, we're dealing with very different types of challenges in a semi-authoritarian regime.
Well, some of this definitely sounds familiar. Where have we heard the narrative that the election was stolen? So we have about 10 more minutes to go. And I think I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. So I have one final question, which is, you were born under Soviet rule.
Yes.
And mostly Gorbachev. And I'm wondering if you thought about, or your parents think about or talk about, any legacy of the Soviet period that might be positive, like particularly in terms of the emancipation of women, which we know was a very problematic Soviet policy in the way it was implemented and even how it was thought out. But I'm wondering if there is any element of, say, Soviet women's emancipation policy that has continued in the post-Soviet period in Georgia.
Well, my family was so anti-Soviet, and my father always felt so repressed by the Soviet regime and its policies, that I don't think there is any aspect of Soviet rule that in our family setting anyway had ever been cast in a positive light. Unfortunately, there are members of, I would say, more of previous generations, perhaps of my grandparents' generations, that would romanticize the Soviet time, not particularly because of the emancipation policies, but mostly on the social policies that for them provided some kind of a safeguard, some kind of a protection. And I think that is particularly because of the extreme poverty that Georgia was thrust into following the demise of the Soviet Union and the civil wars that Georgia had to endure and the inability really of the Shevardnadze era government to sort of shed the Soviet debris and emerge as a market-based, successful economy. So, yeah, I mean, in Georgia, particularly in my generation, you would find very few who would speak positively on any aspect of the Soviet legacy, and I think large part of that reason also is because of Putin's desire to reinstate and reinvent the Soviet Union. And he has stated that the biggest catastrophe, quote unquote, of the last century was the fall of the Soviet Union. He apparently sits in the Kremlin in the premises where Stalin once sat, and still has the big oak office desk from Stalin, and in general regards Stalin, who is, by the way, Georgia born, and born in the same village as my grandmother was, unfortunately. He regarded him as a very powerful and respectable leader and wants to emanate him in many regards. And so as the modern reincarnation of Stalin's policies and the imperial policies in particular that the Soviet Union had in relation to its neighbors, and the expression of that neo-imperialistic aspirations of Putin in terms of the invasion of Georgia and subsequently of Ukraine, which is something, by the way, we had kept warning our Western friends about, but at the time, our warnings had fallen on deaf ears. And right after Georgia's invasion, Putin was offered a reset button, which of course, unfortunately, led nowhere. And now a lot of people who were in decision-making positions at the time admit that it was a wrong turn for U.S.-Russian relations to take after the war, because it exhibited to Putin that he didn't have to pay a price for having invaded another sovereign neighbor. But I think, to go back to the question, I think that, the imperialistic policies of Putin and the continued occupation and the clear desire on his part to reincarnate Stalin and the Soviet Union in general have really left no space for any romanticizing on the Soviet Union in Georgia, in the pro-Western and the young population. Now, there is a small segment in society still that is pro-Russian, but thankfully that has never exceeded, lower single-digit numbers, and that is what brings me hope. That one day we will be successful in joining the European Union. We will be successful in joining NATO. We will have the security that is granted by NATO membership of Article 8, and that we will also be successful in deoccupying our country. And raising future generations of Georgians not in the shadow of the Soviet Union or the reincarnated Soviet Union in the form of Putinist regime, but rather of a free Georgia, of a European Georgia.
Thank you, Tina. I guess I was thinking in Soviet legacy in terms of things like women entering the workforce in larger numbers, which does seem to be one legacy of the Soviet period. But I think it's also what you mentioned about Georgia being partially occupied still by Russia. I think when people talk about Ukraine, they don't include the fact that before Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed Crimea, he had also been kind of nibbling away at Georgia and some of the other states bordering Russia. And as you say, now there's a kind of attempt to imagine the legacy of Stalin. And I've just read that the labor camp, the Gulag museums, is one that's near a mass grave of Gulag victims. They're now saying those weren't Gulag victims, they were Finnish fascists. So there's all this rewriting of history. But in any case, I think we're just about to the end of our session. I really want to thank you so much for this very informative talk. Also, we had mentioned at the beginning that there might be some resources for people who might be interested in doing some more research or reading, I guess, primarily about Georgia. And you said you might be able to just post those. This program will be videoed, will be up on the Davis Center site. I'm not sure how fast that happens, but maybe in addition to that, at the end, if you would be willing to post some suggested readings for people who want to delve deeper into the history of Georgia, and particularly women and gender issues in relation to the current situation in Georgia. So
I'd be happy to. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for the interesting discussion, the questions to the audience. Thank you.
Oh, wait, there's one more. Do I see something else here? Oh, no, just thanks for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.